Hey Greyhounds, and welcome to episode 13 of our NTI book chats. Today's episode is about Joseph Jefferson Jackson, aka Shoeless Joe. And the title of this chapter is Game Over. They all backed up when Joe Jackson went to bat, and every pitcher wished he wasn't there. He was a big man who was great at one thing: baseball. His knuckles reached his knees, and his forearms had the circumference of small trees. Joe's super-sized limbs could swing a bat and nail a baseball so hard it knocked fielders over, ripped gloves out of their hands. Some ducked to get out of the way. It wasn't just his hitting. He could throw a strawberry through a locomotive. Joe was born knowing how to read the seams on a fastball pitch, but he never learned how to read a word. If he had, he would have read about what happens to cheaters, and maybe Joe Jackson wouldn't have become one and wouldn't have fouled against his own talent. Joe was the first of 8 siblings born in rural South Carolina in 1888. The Jacksons moved to Brandon Village, which was built for one purpose: to house workers for the town cotton mill, who'd marry and have lots of babies, who would then grow up and work in the town cotton mill too. Except nobody waited until they grew up to get hired. At about 6 or 7 years old, instead of going to school and learning how to read and write, Joe was inside the mill, sizing, combing, and spooling cotton for 70 hours a week in a haze of cotton fluff. He went home every night with a shirt's worth of cotton in his lungs. If you worked there long enough, you'd die from clogged lungs. Most mill workers eventually went deaf from the loud machines. When he was only 10, after a case of measles, Joe's legs became paralyzed for months. He recovered, but then he had to go back to work again, breathing in lint all day. Mill work was a dead-end poverty trap. The only fun thing for workers to do with their little time off and no money was baseball. You were either playing it or you were in the stands cheering. Joe's abnormally long arms could hurl a ball farther than a grown man could. So at only 13, he got one of the 12 spots on the Brandon Mill team to play against the other Milltown teams. Joe Jackson whacked a lot of 4-baggers, home runs, and people lined up to watch him do it. Plus, he batted lefty or righty, whatever he felt like. Nobody else around was a switch hitter. As the biggest sensation that ever hit Brandon, he was given an easier job at the mill and practice time during work hours. He was paid $2.50 per game, more than he made for a day's work. His life was switching up. He was striking gold. Baseball fever wasn't just in the mill towns. All of America wanted to see more baseball. There were no professional basketball, football, soccer, or hockey teams. The only other professional sport at the time was boxing. People preferred watching double plays rather than 2 guys beating the crud out of each other in a boxing ring, so the competition was slim for America's national pastime. Baseball was it. Every town had a team, and people loved betting money on who would win. Gambling was America's second favorite pastime. It was baseball, betting, and boxing, in that order. The whole Jackson clan got in on the gambling too. While Joe played, his 5 younger brothers would run around in the stands taking bets on whether Joe would get a hit, and then they'd collect the winnings in a hat. Once they collected $29.75 for a home run, equal to the pay for 25 days of work at the mill. Joe playing baseball was a poverty escape grand slam for his entire family. Free to follow the money, Joe played on whichever of the 13 nearby mill teams paid the most. Once he played a game in his socks because his new spikes had blistered his feet. From then on, his nickname was Shoeless. Joe made a smart play when he married Katie Wynn. She had gone to school and could sign the marriage certificate for both of them. They didn't have enough money for a dream honeymoon, but it didn't matter since Joe spent their wedding day playing center field. Then a real dream came true. In 1908, Joe got on a major league team, the Philadelphia Athletics. But when it came time for Shoeless Joe Jackson to take the 600-mile train to Philadelphia, he stayed home. The Athletics managers sent someone to get him, except somewhere along the way, Joe hopped off and went back to his family. A second guy fetched Joe, but he had to watch him like a hawk all the way to Philly. No one could believe this. Shoeless guy wasn't more excited to play in the majors. Going to the major leagues was a major problem for Joe. Maybe Joe dragging his cleats getting to Philly didn't have anything to do with baseball. The 20-year-old was a real country boy, and he had never seen a big city before or been away from his family. Maybe he hesitated because he couldn't read. Joe wouldn't be able to order food from a menu or read a street sign or deal with about 1,000 other things that involved knowing the alphabet. The only thing he could read was a pitch, and that made him a major sensation in the majors when he finally got there. Joe's bat got proper names like Black Betsy, Dixie, and Big Jim. And his bats even got more press than the other players. Joe was a soft-spoken, mild-mannered lug. His teammates were jealous of his superior ball playing and all the attention his bats got, so they harassed him and called him a stupid yokel. Nasty name-calling was acceptable back then. It wasn't just in the dugout. It came from the stands, too. Fans of the opposing team yelled, "Can you spell cat?" And you could fill a book with all the newspaper articles about Joe being a dumb hick. Absolutely no one was winning any good sportsmanship awards. Top to bottom, baseball teams in the 1910s were full of con men, cheats, and drunks. Joe ditched the team and went back to South Carolina to be with his people, but the athletics manager owned Joe's baseball career. So Joe couldn't play for any other team. It was in the contract that Joe had signed but couldn't read. His career would be over. No one could figure out what Joe was thinking. The press decided he wasn't thinking at all. A man who can't read or write simply can't expect to meet the requirements of big league baseball, the sports writer Hugh Fullerton wrote. Another reporter said it was too much for his mental makeup. Out of options, Joe went back to the team and the mistreatment. His only answer to the constant bullying was, "I ain't afraid to tell the world that I don't take school stuff to help it don't take school stuff to help a fellow play ball." No one ever compared him to Shakespeare, but he was right. It was a bunch of guys chasing balls and trying to hit it with a stick. All this abuse made Joe determined to leave the team for good. Who could blame him? The manager could have ended Joe's career right then, but instead of blackballing him, he traded him to a team in Cleveland. Joe stayed in Cleveland, and his family joined him. After a few trades over the years, in 1915, Joe ended up on the Chicago White Sox. He was 28, and holding his own against legendary rival players like Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth. But then World War I changed everything. The season was shortened, and attendance dropped by 40%. Professional baseball was dying, while corruption within the dwindling game thrived. Teams broke up because eligible players joined the army, and average players filled their spots. Joe didn't enlist, and now they called him dumb and a coward. But Joe was the sole support for his parents, a few of his siblings, and their kids, and his wife. The only uniform they wanted him in was a jersey with the team initial on it. The White Sox team was far from a smooth operation. The team manager kept most of the money coming in for himself and didn't pay the players enough. Con men had no trouble finding baseball players willing to lose games on purpose for easy cash. In 1919, the White Sox made it to the World Series, and they were favored by a long shot to beat the Cincinnati Reds. But something was fishy. It looked like the White Sox were playing to lose, and they did, losing the series 5-3. The truth came out later. The series had been fixed. Before the series, a teammate offered Joe $10,000 to help other players on the team lose the series, but Joe said no. Unless Joe was in on the fix, it wouldn't work. He wasn't the cleanup hitter for nothing, and a hitting streak could foil the entire scheme. Joe needed to take one for the team, or he would blow it for everybody. The second offer to Joe was $20,000. Joe's answer was no, but the fix was still on. Joe asked to be benched, but the coach made Joe take the field. During the series, Joe was the only player to get a home run, and he had the highest batting average, .375, of all the players on both teams. His 12 hits during the World Series set the record for decades. After the last game, Lefty Williams, a teammate in on the scam, came to Joe with an envelope full of cash. Joe didn't want it. They argued. Lefty left the envelope with Joe. The next day, Joe attempted to see a manager and tell him what had happened, but the manager wouldn't see him, probably because the manager already knew about the fix, and he'd lose his job if anyone found out. Shoeless Joe Jackson went home with $5,000 cash, which was an odd amount. Did Lefty think Joe couldn't add either? Joe supposedly hadn't participated, but still, that was 15 big ones short of 20 grand. Maybe their argument had been about how Lefty wasn't coming through with all the money. Or was Lefty just sharing a piece of his own winnings? There were loads of accusations about a fix. Like all the players on the White Sox, Joe denied it. But a year later, hauled in front of the grand jury investigating the alleged crime, Joe named names and described some of the things he had done to throw the game. But then later, he took back his confession. No, yes, no. Talk about a switch hitter. It was hard to know the truth. Strangely, the transcript of Joe's grand jury testimony retracting his confession disappeared. It turned up 5 years later in the hands of his manager. Along with 7 other White Sox players, Joe Jackson was thrown out of organized baseball for life, even though they were all acquitted for lack of evidence. But everyone knew the White Sox had switched to the lying Sox of baseball. The White Sox cheating scam became known as the Black Sox Scandal. Joe Jackson was a miraculous baseball player, but it only took 2 strikes to get Joe out of baseball. He lied under oath, and he took the $5,000. Whether he cheated or not, we may never know. Outlaw baseball was all Joe was allowed to play. Back home in South Carolina, Joe ran a dry cleaning business, a pool hall, and owned a liquor store. His long arms weren't swinging any more bats with names. It was fortunate he never learned how to read. He didn't need to read over and over how people thought he was a liar and a cheat. Joe was right when he said the lessons you learn in school don't teach you how to play ball. But he also missed the life lesson that teaches you how to be true to yourself and what happens when you're not. Because in the end, he lost more than one World Series. He lost himself. Shoeless Joe Jackson did what a guy with a gift like his should never do. He threw it away. All right, thank you guys for listening today. We have one more episode left, episode 14. Stay tuned for that.